Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Community Forum on the impact of HB1 in the Tampa Hillsborough area. This is being put on by the ACLU of Florida Tampa Chapter, Greater Tampa Chapter. So we'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Nestor Ortiz, and I'm with the ACLU of Florida, and I will be one of your co-moderators for tonight's Community Forum. And I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, there she is, mic is on now.
Hello, I'm Gretchen Cothron. I'm a Central Florida attorney, and I'm currently volunteering as the president of the ACLU of Florida, the Greater Tampa Bay Chapter. So thank you and welcome this evening.
So again, welcome everyone for participating. Welcome our panelists, which we'll get to in just a moment. But before we do, I just want to go over a few housekeeping things. One, just like we've been experiencing over the past year, we are all on technology. So in the event that I have a lightning strike and my computer goes out, this is a wrap for everything. But technology issues will happen, so please be patient with us as we try to figure them out. We will be dropping links in the chat throughout the community forum. You should be able to find that in the chat when you see it. You will have the opportunity, you will have access to the question and answer feature on the Zoom link. As we're going through the evening, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, feel free to drop them in there. And if time allows at the end, we'll try to get to some of the community questions, okay? Everybody should know when they logged in that the event is being recorded. And then finally, as a webinar, the chat and raise hand feature are available. Actually, the chat feature, I believe, should be open. Yes, it is. And then the raise the hand feature is also available. And those are just some housekeeping things. Gretchen, you want to help us go through the agenda?
Certainly. Thank you, Nestor. So, of course, first I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists this evening, and then Nestor and I are going to give an overview of HB1 for those of you who don't really know the meat of the substance of the bill that was passed. We are then going to go into the moderated questions for the panelists. And those are the questions that were submitted previously prior to this evening. So we'll be going through those questions first. And if there's time, we will open up for questions from the community. Anyone that's present, we do, as Nestor said, we have the Q&A box open. So you can submit questions as they come to mind during the event. So feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box. So now for the introduction of our panelists. I'm sure if you're here, you probably know all three of our panelists. So of course we have Bernice Lauredan. She is a local activist and organizer with Tampa Bay or Bay Area Dream Defenders, as well as with For Our Future. Welcome, Bernice. And we have State Attorney Andrew Warren. He's with the State Attorney's Office for the 13th Judicial Circuit, which encompasses all of Hillsborough County. Welcome, Andrew. And of course, we have Chief Brian Dugan, Chief of the Police Department of the Tampa Police Department, excuse me. Welcome, Brian, Chief Dugan. Thank you all for being here with us and taking time out of your evening to be here. So now I will let Nestor start the background of what HB1 is.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gretchen. And thank you again to all of our panelists for joining us. So if anybody's unfamiliar, we're just going to give a little brief synopsis of what HB1 is, and I'm just going to read it directly from here. Florida's House Bill 1, known as HB1, has been presented as an anti-riot bill created to ensure peaceful protesting and criminalize riots, despite rioting already being a crime. As there are numerous elements to this law, we will try to identify the most critical components as it pertains to local law enforcement efforts. There are several interpretations of the law and how it should be applied. After exhaustive research and detailed scrutiny of the language itself, the ACLU of Florida has tried to provide some clarity with regard to what's captured in this bill. Gretchen and I are going to go over some of the highlights based on what the ACLU has interpreted. Gretchen?
Thank you, Nestor. So the ACLU's interpretation is that HB 1 broadens the legal definition of a riot. So many of the bill's provisions are applicable when a gathering is deemed a riot. So they had to define riot under the law. And it gives law enforcement broad discretion in applying the laws to individuals. So the definition of a riot under HB 1 is, and I'm going to quote this to be exact, a person commits a riot if he or she willfully participates in a violent public disturbance involving an assembly of 3 or more persons acting with a common intent to assist each other in violent and disorderly conduct, resulting in, and there are 3 parts, A, injury to another person, B, damage to property, or C, imminent danger of injury to another person or damage to property.
Thank you for that. Now, it's important to note that once something is deemed a riot, no bail is allowed until first appearance, which is supposed to be within 24 hours of arrest. This may deter people from peacefully protesting altogether. Now, another aspect is a new crime that's been created as part of this bill called mob intimidation. Even if and I'll just kind of quote, even if something is not deemed a riot, it could be deemed mob intimidation, which carries a penalty of up to a year in jail. Now, in the law itself, it says creating the first-degree misdemeanor offense of mob intimidation, which is committed when a person assembled with 2 or more other persons and acting with a common intent uses force or threatens to use imminent force to compel or induce or attempt to compel or induce another person to do or refrain from doing any act or to assume, abandon, or maintain a particular viewpoint against his or her will. That is how the law defines mob intimidation.
Thank you. And so another new crime that was put under the bill is doxing, which those who are familiar with the legal system, we know we used to call this cyberbullying. It's very similar. Doxing is defined as publishing someone's information online, and it can now amount to a first-degree misdemeanor, which locally can get you up to a year in jail. And it's called cyber intimidation by publication. And there's also another new part of the law which protects monuments. And the law now provides special provisions and protections to these monuments, memorials, and objects that are deemed historic objects. And it's a pretty loose definition. So it's open for interpretation as to what a historic object is.
Another aspect of the law, and this is a really important one, and this is, in my opinion, one of the most egregious ones. It protects those who harm protesters. The law provides an affirmative defense in civil action for personal injury, wrongful death, or property damage if the person harmed is shown to be a participant acting in furtherance of a riot by either convictions or the preponderance of evidence. What this basically means is if a person who is harmed at a gathering sues the person who harmed them, the person they sue can claim that they should not be held responsible because the injured person was rioting.
And one of the most important things I think about this law is that it's another, it's eroding home rule. Again, another law by the state to set erodes home rule. And home rule, for those not lawyers out there, that home rule means that local governments should have home rule. They can govern their own areas. But what we're seeing in the state of Florida a lot recently is statewide laws that take away a local government's ability to govern their own people. So the law here gives the governor veto power over local police budgets if any local officials desire to appeal what the local government has decided as law enforcement budget. So say the city of Tampa or Hillsborough County do their budget, there are people that could appeal that and go to the state and ask the state government to take away the right of the local government to do their own budget. It also exposes local governments to unlimited damage liability in lawsuits. Local governments have historically there's been a cap on how much you can get if you sue them for things. Under this law, it takes away that cap. So local governments have unlimited liability after any gathering that is deemed a riot, if the local government is then found to hinder the ability for law enforcement to respond appropriately to protect persons and property.
Thank you for that. So you'll notice in the chat feature, I dropped 2 links. The first link is the official bill language summary provided by the Senate and the House. And then the second link is the ACLU of Florida summary and overall their interpretation, our interpretation of what's found in the law. Now, feel free to peruse that on your own, or during this meeting. So that brings us to the most important part of this evening, which is the questions. So now we're going to dig in with our panelists. Now, before we get started, I just want to note that the following questions are comprised of questions generated by community organizations and Hillsborough and Tampa residents. So we're just Gretchen and I are going to go back and forth, and we're going to bounce it around to our panelists. So without further ado, Gretchen, why don't you start us off?
Okay, so I am going to start off with Chief Dugan. So everyone wants to know how have you and how is Tampa conveying HB1 to your TPD officers? Like, what direction are you giving them?
Well, I think what we do is we have what we call a legal bulletin, which is basically a synopsis of the law and the bill and how we interpret it. Now, if you listen to Nestor when he reads this is a very difficult bill to digest, in my opinion. And our legal bulletin is 16 pages long. So it's it's very difficult. What we've done is we had a Zoom call with all of our commanders to interpret the law and then tell them what our expectations are as a command staff. And we're going to work with the protesters or demonstrators or whatever we want to call them to have peaceful protest, have peaceful demonstration, and work with them, which is what we always do. And, I'm not sure what they were trying to accomplish with this, but I'm not sure it really changes our philosophy on how we're going to deal with people in these situations.
Thank you. I do. Just reading the language, it is very complicated. I'm sure non-lawyers were probably listening to us going, yes.
Thank you for that, Chief Dugan. I just noticed that when I dropped the links in the chat, I only sent it to the panelists. Shout out to Belle for letting us know that the attendees also would like the link, which makes more sense, I suppose. So I just dropped that, so everybody should actually have access to that now. So thank you. Chief Dugan, thank you for that response. The next question I have here is for Bernice. What impact do we envision HB1 having on the ability for protesters to ultimately protest?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nestor. That's a great question. I think we're still waiting to see what the impact is going to be. When I first heard about the bill, I definitely thought this was going to negatively harm like folks' movement spaces. Like it would prevent people from planning protest or going to protest because they'd be fearful of getting charged with a crime. But honestly, over the weekend, we had some incredible protests in Temple Terrace and in Tampa. And so it was really amazing and exciting to see like hundreds of people come out in the street to protest. This time was for Palestine. And so, you know, I'm not sure. I thought at first that this would harm and prevent folks from actually protesting, but we're seeing it's not stopping people, and people are still going out and making their voices heard.
Thank you for that, Bernice. I really appreciate it. Now, as we continue to go through the questions, Gretchen and I, based on your response, we want this to feel like a lively conversation. So we might challenge, we might push back, we might ask a follow-up question. So just putting that out there. So thank you for that, Bernice.
So our next question is going to be for State Attorney Warren. Does someone have to commit, and this is just for your office in particular, or hypothetical, does someone have to commit an overt act in furtherance of a riot to be arrested or prosecuted for participating in an event where someone else caused injury or property damage, or is it enough just to be there?
Well, Gretchen, that's the million-dollar question, right? You know, I had a lot of concerns about the bill because I felt like the definition of a riot in this bill expanded the definition that was already on the books in Florida. And we don't want to get into the legal weeds of this, but unfortunately we have to just a little bit. The law in Florida used to be that a riot was defined as essentially a violent public disturbance. So you had to participate in a violent public disturbance of 3 or more people. And we all know what that means. You know, if somebody is, you know, burning down a store or looting or destroying property or attacking law enforcement and 3 people are doing it in concert, that's a riot. This bill changes the definition, and it went through different iterations as it went through the legislative process. But the end result now is we have a law that doesn't say you have to participate in the violence itself. It just says you have to participate in a violent public disturbance. And the law leaves just enough wiggle room that if there is a public disturbance of, say, 100 people, and 3 of them decide to do something bad that we all agree is bad, does that turn the entire disturbance now into a violent public disturbance? And if so, do the other 97 people there who are continuing to participate peacefully, are they willfully participating in a violent public disturbance? That's the issue. And again, the law leaves just enough wiggle room where I think there is a legitimate concern that you can be prosecuted just for mere presence. And to go back to a point that the chief made, he said, you know, it's not really going to affect what we're doing. Not sure what the point is. Yeah, I'm not sure what the point of this law was either. And we'll leave the, you know, the political speculation aside. But in terms of the tools that it gives prosecutors, it doesn't really help us. In terms of giving additional tools to law enforcement, it doesn't really help. I mean, Chief Dugan talked about you have a 16-page bulletin for law enforcement officers to have to make a split-second decision about what's happening on the scene. That's not helpful. So at the end of the day, we've created a lot of confusion in the law by blurring the line between peaceful protest and people who are committing crimes participating in a riot. And that's what the danger is. And I hope that, you know, as Bernice said, we're not seeing this chill people's willingness to come out and exercise their First Amendment rights to free speech and free assembly.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Much appreciated. And actually, I think you brought up a couple of good points, which brings me to my next question for Chief Dugan. Chief, do you have any concerns that TPD officers, and you mentioned the bulletin in the former question, but do you have any concerns that TPD officers will interpret the law in different ways, depending on the community of protesters, with possibly more severe interpretations of the law for maybe protesters that are demanding things like police reform or defunding versus protesters that are encouraging police support, like Blue Lives Matter? Do you have any concerns about potential bias? And then how would the department mitigate that bias?
Yes, I do have concerns. I'm sure that kind of surprises you to hear me say that, but yeah, I have some concerns about that. We're only human. That's why we do implicit bias training. That's why I personally have talked to my command staff about this and done videos for the officers. I'm very much concerned about it. We have to be colorblind, so to speak, or whatever the phrase is. We have to be very neutral in how we enforce this. And we've been very careful about all this stuff. And we've taken a very hands-off approach to so many of these things. A month ago, we had a Black Lives Matter march that we didn't even show to. They didn't ask for our help. There were no problems. We weren't even there. We had a Palestinian demonstration over the weekend, and we assisted them, blocked the streets so that nobody got hurt, and we had no problems. We had a little reckless driving going on, but there were no real problems, so to speak. So the short answer is yes, I'm concerned. We do a lot of training, a lot of communication. I'm sure that surprises you to hear me say that, but yes, I am concerned, and that's why we have a detailed bulletin, and we do a lot of discussions about that.
Thank you, Chief Dugan. I'm actually not surprised. I would hope that anybody that is in law enforcement would have those same concerns. I will say, and just before I pass it over to Gretchen for the next question, I will say that my concern is less, my personal concern is less so the implementation of the law now, but instead when people decide to take to the streets later, sometime in the future. So although I appreciate the hesitation your officers are using when they're out in the streets today, my concern is that given that it's on the books, down the road, it might be applied more aggressively. So I feel like to say that this should be a continued concern as long as the law exists. So thank you for that. Gretchen.
Okay, so our next question is for State Attorney Warren. The people want to know, have there been any cases filed challenging the constitutionality of this bill? And if so, do you think that this is a bill that that the Florida Supreme Court will accept jurisdiction over to review the constitutionality of it?
Well, there have been a couple lawsuits filed already. There was one filed by attorneys out of Orlando, and a group down in Miami, Community Justice Partnership, filed a lawsuit as well. I believe that I know that other organizations are considering filing lawsuits because I've spoken with them about it, and they have shared some of the concerns that I raised before about the constitutionality of the law, not just with regard to the definition of a riot, but with regard to the provision about home rule. There are a bunch of problems in the bill that make one wonder whether it is going to pass constitutional scrutiny. I hope that the Supreme Court takes it up because we don't want the law to be unclear. And you've seen law enforcement agencies, a couple of them around the state, similar to what Chief Dugan indicated earlier, they're not exactly sure how to deal with this law. It creates a problem when our law enforcement is not sure what they're allowed to do or what they can't do. It's concern for prosecutors when it allows that wiggle room to prosecute people who may not have done anything wrong. So I certainly hope that we get some clarity from the courts, and clarity that comes down on the side of protecting people's constitutional rights and drawing a very clear line of distinction between peaceful protest and criminal conduct.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Also, I just want to note another lawsuit that was recently filed was Dream Defenders versus DeSantis, which the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Educational Fund, the ACLU of Florida is part of that, the Community Justice Project, and several other organizations. For anybody interested, any of the attendees that are interested in that, I'm actually dropping the link to that lawsuit in the chat now if you want to check that out. So thank you for that. So the next question is actually, Brian, for you again. What does this look like on the ground in real time during these protests? So when you have organizations like Dream Defenders, Black Lives Matter, shout out to Black Lives Matter locally as well as Dream Defenders. When you have organizations on the ground, what does this look like for your law enforcement agents or officers? Are they actively looking for something, or are they just kind of passively participating as officers?
What we try to do is just keep an eye on it, so to speak, from a far distance and keep our distance. Now, if a large crowd gathers, that's when we'll initiate some type of contact, trying to determine who the leaders are, and then see what they want to do, how they want to get their message out, and work with them. You know, the last year, we've never had the type of conflicts with law enforcement and demonstrators like we did this past year. We've always worked with them. Several of the times we would meet with them and they would refuse to talk to us. But when they're willing to work with us, we work with them. This weekend's a perfect example. We actually blocked traffic and let them take over the roadway to get their message out. At one point, they even asked us to please reopen the roadway because they wanted cars to go through their demonstration to get their message out. So if people are willing to work with us, we'll work for them. But it really is a balance between protection, having safe passage to potential hospitals, getting ambulances through. And so we just have to work together. And, but if it's not a public safety issue, we won't even get involved in it.
Thank you for that, Chief Dugan.
Then we're going to switch over to similar question to Bernice. So Bernice, what adjustments, if any, are you encouraging potential protesters and organizers to make in preparation of the law?
I think definitely folks should be, as much as possible, doing know your rights training. So like sharing with the community and sharing with the folks who are involved in the protest what exactly their legal rights are when they are protesting. And also, it's also about having folks just be more aware of their surroundings. And my other advice to people is stay out of the street as much as possible. Like just being in the street under this law is like, with more than 3 people becomes a felony charge, or there's a lot in the law that I just don't understand or don't get why they did that. But so staying out of the streets would also be advice as much as possible.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Bernice. This next question is for State Attorney Warren. How will the State Attorney's Office respond to cases presented where there is so much kind of gray area in the interpretation of the law? Things like mob intimidation, definition of a riot as obstruction of the public roads. There's so much kind of wiggle room, as noted by both you and Chief Dugan. There's so much kind of wiggle room or room for interpretation. How will the State Attorney's Office kind of respond to those things as those cases come in front of you?
I mean, frankly, the same way we always do, which is we have to start with the law and the evidence we have to support it. So, I mean, if we have a case that is worthwhile, meaning it serves the public interest to prosecute because someone has done something bad, and I use that in the sense of the word that we all understand it, and that person should be prosecuted to be held accountable for their bad conduct, then that's a case that we want to prosecute. Now, whether we can prosecute it is the second question, and that's based on what the evidence we have is. So, for example, there are times where, and I'll use the example of House Bill 1, but this applies to just about any circumstance. If we have reason to believe that someone is, looting a store during an otherwise peaceful protest, and to go back to my example of there are 3 people doing something really bad and there are 97 there who are just yelling and waving signs, we know that 3 people did something bad. Can we identify who the 3 people are, which is often one of the biggest challenges for law enforcement? And do we have admissible evidence to prove that in court? If we do, we'll go forward with the case. But when we can't distinguish between the 97 and the 3, we're not going to file charges on it because we have no reason to believe that we can distinguish between the peaceful protester and the criminal actor. To talk about this in the scenario of mob intimidation, the mob intimidation law that it's included in House Bill 1 is very similar to laws that were already on the books. But one change is it talks about using force or the threat of force to intimidate or harass someone, to coerce someone to change their viewpoint. That's extremely subjective. I'm really not sure what that means. Again, it'd be helpful to have some clarity from the courts. But if it's a situation where we feel like someone was doing something that we recognize is bad, and we can prove that they were harassing, intimidating, threatening, assaulting, battering, with the intent, even that highly subjective intent to change someone's mind, then that's a case that if we had the evidence, we would try to prosecute. But our goal is clear. It's to draw that distinction between people doing bad things and people who are just exercising their First Amendment rights. Being able to draw that line is sometimes more difficult than it sounds because it's based on the facts that we have at hand and the evidence we can bring to court. But that's where we draw the line.
Thank you very much for that intro. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So then on that note, we're going to flip it over to Chief Brian Dugan. So this bill is often being called the anti-riot bill. So the community wants to know, how does your department define a riot? And is that definition up for interpretation for an individual officer, or does the department have an interpretation that all the officers should be carrying?
Yeah, the way we look at it, if you want to define the word riot, is if you're damaging property and harming other people. That's really what it comes down to. And it's a difficult balance between their First Amendment rights and policing. So really, when it comes, when you start setting things on fire, like we had the one night, that's a riot, and that's when it's a problem. But just like the state attorney said earlier, where it becomes problematic is you have to single out the actors, so to speak, that are doing the crime, as opposed to just some mass arrest, and it really becomes difficult. And so it's a challenge for law enforcement. I don't know if the system was really designed to deal with some of these problems, quite frankly. You have people that are upset with society and they're acting out. And I sometimes think that, making an arrest can maybe solve the problem for the moment, but it makes ultimately the bigger issue even worse. And whereas I know the state attorney and I have had discussions of what is the value in prosecuting some of these cases when you do make an arrest. And so, to answer your question, is when they start doing damage to property and harming other people.
Thank you for that. If I could just add kind of a follow-up, is it possible, and this is for Chief Dugan, is it possible that protesters are out there protesting, and to State Attorney's example earlier, we have 100 people, and then those 3 people cause some issue? Is it possible, even though the bill indicates that the entire thing is a public riot, Is it possible that your officers will still just go in and isolate those 3 individuals, remove them, and then people can continue peacefully protesting?
No, that will be our ultimate strategy, is to go after the bad actors. And what happens is for lack of a better term, these peaceful demonstrations get hijacked, is the term that we use. They hijack them and take over, and they use the other peaceful demonstrators as cover to be able to do some of the things that they're doing. And, sometimes people will point out and say, that guy right there. And sometimes they'll tell them, hey, if you're going to do that, we don't want you here. And so, yes, ultimately our goal is to go after the bad actors and not just make mass arrests.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Thank you. And then Bernice, the community wants to know from you, are you concerned that in particular, Black and brown protesters might receive more citations or different treatment than, say, Caucasian protesters?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I am definitely concerned about that. And when we think about like where this law even came from, it originated after the Black Lives Matter protests that came from last year. And so in my mind, that the intent is to address those protests. So it does make me concerned, particularly for Black and brown folks, that they will be disproportionately targeted as opposed to other groups.
Thank you for that, Bernice. So this next question is for Chief Dugan. Do you anticipate any bandwidth issues in enforcement of the law? So, yeah.
Well, I'm not really sure what they mean by bandwidth. Is it the number of people? How are we interpreting bandwidth?
So I understand this question to mean, excuse me, is your agency able to respond in the event that something like the number of protests that happened last year, or excuse me, last summer, does your agency have the capacity to handle and manage the sheer number of protests in response to HB1? Do you see this being an issue that will overwhelm the agency slightly?
It could potentially overwhelm us. There was no doubt on May 30th, 5 days after George Floyd was murdered, the night the Champs was set on fire, we were overrun, overwhelmed. We didn't have enough cops in our agency to deal with that. I don't know if people realize that we had to park police cars around the district office bumper to bumper because of the violence that was taken as they smashed windows of police cars and attacked cops, set gas stations on fire and things like that. And what was sad is, hours earlier, myself and Chief Castor marched with the demonstrators. And then when nightfall came, those peaceful demonstrators went home, and then the bad actors came out. When you have large crowds like that are unruly, it's very difficult. It's very much a concern. That's why we do so much. We rely on peaceful demonstrators working with us. But when the crowds get large and we get overwhelmed, it is difficult, and it's very much a concern.
Thank you for that. And when you say Chief Castor, I'm assuming you mean Mayor Castor.
Yeah, I'm sorry. She was my boss for 6 years. So I guess now she's my boss again. So
just providing clarification, just making sure that I'm not missing anyone. Thank you for that, Chief.
And our final question is similar for Andrew Warren, State Attorney Warren. And Nestor, I'm guessing these two questions I'm going to say that they're millennial questions because of the bandwidth. I don't think these were written by boomers in the audience. So what impact does the State Attorney's Office anticipate the HB1 will have on your operational bandwidth? Are you making any special preparations?
So the short answer is not much of an impact in terms of the overall operations of our office. I mean, we handle some 60 to 70,000 cases a year, so I don't think this is going to change anything dramatically in terms of the amount of work we have. But it does impact the work we do on these types of cases. The last year, that the one night of widespread riots that we had that the chief has talked about, we had something like 130 cases come out of that. And it was really difficult work. It was difficult police work to identify the people who were responsible for setting stores on fire and doing all the really bad things we saw on TV. And it's tough work for prosecutors too. Those are not easy cases for law enforcement or for prosecutors. And we had to do a lot of work to go through to identify, as I described before, do we know that we got the right person? Do we know that we have a reason to go forward? Do we have the evidence to prove the case? These are not simple cases when you have a large group of people and a relatively small number of people who are doing bad things among that large group. So again, the impact overall is small, but the impact when you're the one person who's been charged and you feel like you didn't do anything wrong and you got caught up with other people, then yeah, there's a lot of impact on you. And I wish that we could process the cases more quickly, but it is a very tedious, meticulous process for us to make sure that we have the right person, we're charging them with the right offense, and we have the evidence to go forward.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So we now have an opportunity to open the questions up to the floor if you all are comfortable. Before we do that, I want to come back to a question in the very beginning that we asked Chief Dugan about how his HB1 been conveyed to TPD officers. Now, I know you mentioned the 16-point bulletin, which is great. Or the 16-page bulletin or 16-point?
16-page.
Wow, that's a long page. So I guess for me personally, I'm just looking for, when you're sharing this with your officers, other than just handing them that 16-page bulletin, how are you conveying the message of how we respond to this as a community? Like, how are you sharing that and that gets trickled down? Are you saying exactly what you've been saying on this call, which is, hey, like, there are lots of different interpretations. Let's just do what we can to support the community. Let's partner. Let's do all these things. Or are you saying enforce the law as you need to based on how the law is read?
No, just because there's a violation of the law, so to speak, doesn't mean you need to make an arrest. And what I've done is I met with my commanders. We always, if there's going to be a demonstration, we do our best to have a lieutenant or above there. And, we work with people. We're willing, I think what kind of gets lost in a lot of this is we had so many peaceful demonstrations over the past year, and only a few of them resulted in arrest. Now, some of them were very high profile, some of them were high in numbers. On 4th of July, we made about 10 arrests, but what people don't realize, and I understand people are busy, they don't really understand, but they blocked Dale Mabry at, I want to say, Spruce Street for over an hour. We worked with them to get their First Amendment rights, get their freedom of speech out there. But at some point, when it's a major roadway, I don't know what people expect us to do as a police department. So, we have gotten the word down to the troops, and it's about patience and understanding and working with them. And we hope that we don't want to make an arrest. An arrest is the last resort in the whole thing. And we have had a long history of working with people who want to work with us. I think Bernice hit the nail on the head when she said, know your rights, because if you know your rights, you're much more likely to understand where law enforcement is coming from, and you're have a better understanding of being able to work with law enforcement.
Thank you for that, Chief Dugan. I feel like just like we're encouraging protesters and people who want to take to the streets to voice their thoughts and values and ideas, I think it's also equally as important, just like we ask protesters to know their rights, that officers of any agency would also understand the law and then understand the law itself, and then understand the department's overall understanding and interpretation of that law. So not so much encouraging that application or that implementation of the law, but more so discouraging, and instead providing a level of support to the community that they're there to protect. So so thank you for that. Thank you for that. So now we have an opportunity to open it up to the floor. Quick time check, it is 7:17, which means we actually have about 12 minutes that we can ask and answer a few questions. So if you all are good, I'm just going to jump right into it, if that works for you guys. Awesome. I'm going to hit this answer live button as we go through the questions. And I believe the question will pop up on the screen, but I've never done it. So here we go. Okay, so the first question. All right. This first question, do we know how this is being interpreted in other surrounding cities, counties, etc., such as close by Pinellas County? And I believe that question can be directed at either State Attorney Warren or Chief Dugan.
Also, I'm not comfortable answering that. I've talked to the other agencies in the area to kind of get a feel for what they're doing, but we really, each city is different in a way. The culture of each city is different. And like I said, I'm comfortable that we're going to do everything we can to work with demonstrators to get their word out and not make an arrest.
Thank you for that. Okay, we have an anonymous attendee that is asking, are there concerns that there will be an uptick in vigilante justice given the protection of those who take matters into their own hands to use their cars and weapons or any other avenues to block or push back protesters? If so, what is and can be done about that? I'm gonna both ask to hear from both Chief Dugan as well as Bernice. Do you have any concerns about those things? So Chief Dugan, if you want to answer that first, and then we'll pass it.
Sure. Yes, I have some concerns of that. I have concerns actually on both sides, though. My worry is that someone's going to try and get arrested for a violation of this law so that they can be, then have standing in the courts to be able to contest the constitutionality of the law. So I have some concerns on both sides. I don't want to see anyone get hurt and get arrested. When law enforcement gets involved in these situations, nobody wins. It's a major concern of mine, quite frankly, on both ways.
Thank you for that, Chief Dugan. Bernice?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely a concern. And, I was there last summer and witnessed a friend get run over by a car during a protest. And it's very shocking when it happens. But I think all of the rumors surrounding this law and the fact that folks think that they can actually hit somebody and essentially get away with it makes me feel that it might empower some folks to take bad action.
Thank you for that, Bernice. Much appreciated. Gretchen, you want to take it? Oh, you're on mute, Gretchen.
What? I'm not a cat. The next question comes from Roderick. He wants to know, he says that he was downtown for the Buccaneers celebration and he felt that it went out of control. And he was asking, from a law enforcement standpoint, could that have been considered a riot? Were many arrests made? And or was that an unexpected disturbance?
Well, it was an unexpected disturbance that maybe could have turned into a small version of a riot, if you wanted to call it that. We did make a few arrests. We were, again, just overwhelmed with people. And because of the Super Bowl, we had so many people at the stadium, so many people in Ybor City, we were stretched thin. We had almost the entire department working. And again, we try to work with people to avoid making arrests. I think sometimes people don't ever realize that as a law enforcement officer and you put handcuffs on somebody and you take them into custody, you're also kind of stuck with them, so to speak. Like you have to process them, take them to jail. And how do you get them to a police car? How do you get them transported? So in those situations, we really do our best to not make an arrest and just hope that everyone works with us.
Thank you for that, Chief Dugan. So we have an anonymous attendee. I'm going to go ahead and read their question. There have been documented violent attacks on protesters in the Tampa Bay area, including 4 incidents of motorists driving into protesters in Tampa, June 21st, June 27th, July 4th, and September 15th. HB 1 only eliminated civil liability for someone who causes injury to anyone engaged in what is considered a riot. They can still be arrested and charged with a crime. Because of disinformation, many people falsely believe that recreational violence against protesters is now legal in Florida. Will TPD or the state attorney's office be doing anything to combat the threat of recreational or politically motivated violence? And I'll direct that to State Attorney Warren.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't have to be politically motivated violence, any types of violence. Someone who's just frustrated that there are protesters blocking the street, the HB 1 gives them some civil liability protection, but it doesn't make it no longer a crime if they run them over with their car. And so I don't know all 4 instances that the questioner is referring to, but there were a couple. For example, there was one where somebody ran into people on Dale Mabry, and we filed charges. TPD was able to identify the person responsible. There was one in Hyde Park last year where there were a lot of witnesses saw a truck run over somebody, and we didn't have a single witness who could actually identify the driver. So we had a good idea who it was, but we didn't have the evidence to actually go into court and prove a case. But those are just 2 examples of how we have filed charges, or we've been willing to file charges in situations where someone is running over a protester. And we'll continue to do the same going forward. The law doesn't change that, even though, as both the chief and Bernice said just a moment ago, there are concerns that the interpretation of this law is now going to make people feel like they're allowed to do it, even though they're not.
Yeah, Nestor, if you wouldn't mind if I interject there. I don't know much. I did recall on July 4th, there was someone who rode through the crowd. We spent, as Andrew Warren said, we spent an extensive amount of time investigating that case, direct filed charges. That person was prosecuted, pled no contest, and received probation, which would be standard and appropriate for that type of case. So people weren't just let off the hook on some of these things. That case was prosecuted, and we spent an extensive amount of time on that. And I looked it up this morning because I specifically remembered that case, because what the story was that gentleman driving the car told us and what our investigation revealed were 2 different things. So he was later charged and prosecuted.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, both the State Attorney Warren and Chief Dugan, or Brian and Andrew.
I'm Nestor. I'm sorry. If I can just jump back in.
Please do.
It's an example of how difficult this process is for law enforcement and for prosecutors. If you have a situation where you have not just 100, you have hundreds of people in the street, and you have some cars that are trying to go around them. And let's say it's a law enforcement is there and they're allowing people to block the street and they're trying to steer traffic around. And you have, 1 out of every 50 cars where somebody gets annoyed and just sort of hits the gas and may hit somebody or, almost hit somebody. Law enforcement has to go back, figure out who it was, where those cars were, who was hurt. It's a difficult case for us to prosecute. And nothing in this law makes it any easier for us to do our jobs. In fact, it makes it harder, because now you're potentially creating the incentive for more people to do that. You're making law enforcement have to understand a 16-page bulletin about what laws they're enforcing. You are creating a larger universe of people who may get arrested or potentially prosecuted for committing crimes that weren't crimes as of a month ago. This doesn't help the job that law enforcement and prosecutors are trying to do, which goes back to the fundamental point of, we're trying to make sure that people can peacefully protest, and we're trying to make sure that people are held accountable when they commit crimes.
Thank you for that, State Attorney Warren. Andrew, thank you for that. So I'm recognizing the time. So this is going to be the last and final question, but this is the question that'll be for all three panelists. How can we safely protest? From your perspective, how can we safely protest to avoid getting arrested if something does happen at a protest that people attend? How can we safely protest? So I would love, from your individual perspectives, what would be your advice to somebody who wants to protest, but also wants to avoid getting arrested? What's something they can do to avoid that? Oh, okay, that's awesome.
I can go first. Yeah, I can go first. I would say one like tool or one thing that I would learn is learning de-escalation. If you can actually help to de-escalate a situation, it might prevent it from blowing up into a bigger situation and causing law enforcement involvement. And so learning de-escalation tools and tactics, and definitely doing the Know Your Rights trainings are two ways that I can think of to safely protest.
Thank you for that, Bernice. Chief Dugan or State Attorney Warren?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is cooperating with law enforcement and communicating with law enforcement. There was a time, there was one protest or march or whatever, where they went from downtown Tampa all the way out Kennedy Boulevard to Fox 13 station and then back, and TPD assisted them in their march to do that, and we worked with them. We had the Sunday after the riots where Champs was set on fire. That Sunday there was a Black Lives Matter march of thousands of people, and we worked with them, and they were able to have a peaceful march with no problems. Now, we had problems afterwards, but it was not the people who participated in that particular march. It was a group that hijacked the whole entire area after the march. But I think you have to communicate. I think Bernice hit the nail on the head. Know your rights, understand it, but really communicate with law enforcement. I think a lot more can get accomplished.
Thank you for that.
I'd agree with what Bernice and the chief said, and I would add from the prosecutorial standpoint that if you are at a protest or any sort of large public gathering and you're seeing some people who are breaking the law, move away. Don't put yourself in a position where you're making it harder to distinguish between the people who are there doing the right thing and the people who are there doing the wrong thing. And it makes law enforcement's job easier. It increases the likelihood that you are not going to get caught up and be associated with the people who are doing the bad thing. And of course, down the road, it simplifies the job for prosecutors to identify the people who are doing bad versus the vast majority of people who are there doing good.
Thank you for that, State Attorney Warren. Thank you to all our panelists for answering all these questions, both the ones that we had previously and opening it up to the floor. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you all. And Nestor, I'll close out by giving a little ACLU plug. So for everyone watching, if your organizations ever need legal observers, please contact us, Greater Tampa ACLU at gmail.com. We do have a list of, I think we have about 50 attorneys that volunteer, as well as other community organizers that volunteer as legal observers. And what they do is just observe, really, just to make sure and alert organizers if anything looks like it's going to go down. So any organizations, if you're having a protest, feel free to reach out to us. And to everyone, on behalf of the Greater Tampa Chapter of the ACLU of Florida, we'd like to thank our panelists, Bernice, Lauredan, Chief Brian Dugan, State Attorney Andrew Warren, my co-moderator, Nestor Ortiz. Thank you. Thank you everyone for participating in this panel this evening. Thank you to all the Zoom attendees who are here. We will also be posting this on Facebook and YouTube. And if you'd like to share this evening's community forum, once we have it set up and posted, you'll be able to go to the Greater Tampa chapter of the ACLU's Facebook page and share it from there.
So without further ado, thank you so much. We wish everybody a wonderful evening. Thank you again, panelists, for being on, and thank you for all the attendees. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Great job.